25 million people confined to their homes, manufacturing grinding to a halt with little moving in and out of the largest container port in the world.
Any business that produces physical goods is being disrupted by what's happening in China.
Nothing has emphasized the fragility of the global economy more than the COVID era. And while inflation seems to be the top subject on most of these economic shows or in economic reporting, fact of the matter is there seems to be very little attention to the fact that we rely heavily on manufacturing in China for our goods here in the United States. And guess what? Huge portions of that country are currently on lockdown in response to the Omicron coronavirus variant. So I want to give you the details on that, talk a little bit about the ramifications and what we should be considering for the future. So as CNN Business reported, most alarming is the indefinite lockdown in Shanghai, a city of 25 million and one of China's premier manufacturing and export hubs. The quarantines have led to food shortages, inability to access medical care, and even reported pet killings. They've also left the largest port in the world understaffed. So China has a zero COVID policy. They take coronavirus much more seriously than pretty much any other country, certainly more seriously than the United States has. But I would argue that they're on an extreme, level that I would not be an advocate for in any other country, in any other place in the world, especially because of the impact it's having on the people of China, the lack of access to food as a result of this. There is this mass effort by the government to send food to individuals in the country as they're experiencing these lockdowns. But there have been some reports showing what they're receiving, and it's not nearly enough for them to, survive on, really. And so China's recent pandemic response is likely to cost at least $46 billion in lost economic output per month, or 3.1% of GDP. And that's according to research from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. But it's one thing to discuss the impact that it's having in China, which is dire, which is terrible. Remember, we're also connected. We're all interconnected as a result of this global economy. And so when we're discussing inflation, it's really important to consider that the domestic policies in countries that we rely on heavily for manufacturing will have a ripple effect on our own economy. So the port of Shanghai, for instance, which handled over 20% of Chinese freight traffic in 2021, is essentially at a standstill. Food supplies stuck in shipping containers without access to refrigeration are rotting. Incoming cargo is now stuck at Shanghai marine terminals for an average of 8 days before it's transported elsewhere, which is a 75% increase since the recent round of lockdowns began. And more than 90% of trucks supporting import and export deliveries, by the way, are currently out of action. They are not operating as we speak. And there are many major companies that we tend to think of as American, but they do a lot of their manufacturing in China. For instance, Sony and Apple supplier plants in and around Shanghai are idle. Quanta, the world's biggest contract notebook manufacturer and a MacBook maker, has stopped production entirely. The plant accounts for about 20% of Quanta's notebook production capacity, and the company previously estimated it would ship 72 million units this year. Tesla previously shuttered its Shanghai Gigafactory, which produced about 2,000 electric cars per day. Now, they are in the process of reopening. There's been a significant amount of pressure to start opening up these factories and these warehouses again and get these workers back in action. But what's really devastating to the workers in China is that they have to work in conditions that are actually even worse than the conditions that we've come to learn about in previous years, because the government is still trying to implement this zero COVID policy. So what does it look like to be a worker in China that has to undergo lockdowns and quarantines, but is also pressured to go back to work? Well, let's take a quick look at that.
Feeling pressure, the government asking businesses to restart operations, many creating job site bubbles where workers sleep in offices for weeks. Truck drivers subjected to daily testing, stuck at checkpoints for days. China's lockdown could lead to an unprecedented tsunami of cargo entering our country in the coming months. It would look a lot like last fall, a major traffic jam at our nation's ports.
And I want to focus a little bit on what is happening to Tesla workers specifically, because as I mentioned, they're starting to open back up. They're starting to get the workers to come back to work, but the conditions are pretty terrible. So Tesla workers at the automaker's facility in Shanghai will be required to sleep on the factory floor as Tesla restarts production after a 3-week shutdown. The location will be operating as a closed loop system in order to avoid further shutdowns amid China's zero tolerance policy for COVID-19 infections. And so will they be provided with anything to make sleeping on the factory floor a little more comfortable? Well, Tesla will provide workers with a sleeping bag and mattress and set aside a portion of the factory floor to be used as sleeping accommodations. Workers will also be expected to work 12 hours a day with 1 day off every 6 days, Bloomberg reported. Previously, the employees would work 8-hour shifts with 4 days on and 2 days off. So not only are they being forced to sleep on the factory floor, they're being forced to go back to work. They're also being forced to overwork, I'm guessing, to make up for the fact that they've been doing these lockdowns and they've been quarantining. This is not a system that I'm in any way in favor of. So I feel terrible for the workers in China. I mean, we should have been already feeling terrible for the workers in China, because the whole reason why most of our manufacturing takes place in countries like China is so these corporations can take advantage of cheap labor, and they could take advantage of these abusive environments for workers. At the same time, though, that also has a ripple effect on our own economy and the global economy, because again, if we're relying on China to make these products and they're shutting down as a result of COVID, that means we're not going to have the supply that we typically would have of the various products that are manufactured in these countries like China. And so what will the outcome of all of this be? Well, American economic leaders believe decoupling is already underway. Oak Tree co-founder Howard Marks wrote in a memo in late March, by the way, that the pendulum has swung back toward local sourcing and away from globalization. BlackRock chairman Larry Fink echoed the sentiment in a letter to the company's shareholders. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, he wrote, has put an end to globalization we have experienced over the last 3 decades. Now, I would venture to say that the statements coming from executives or anyone working at places like BlackRock should be taken with a grain of salt, because they act as though globalization and essentially outsourcing American jobs to various companies various countries was just, it just happened. It was just like a natural thing that happened. There were no economic forces behind those decisions, when in reality, all you have to do is take a step back and see why these jobs were shipped to other countries in the first place. Again, it was all about maximizing profit for these corporations. It was all about ensuring that they were able to manufacture these products as cheaply as possible. And in order to do that, you would need to rely on a workforce that is underpaid, that is not unionized, that has really no say over their working conditions. And what better place to do that than China? And the workers have been dealing with this kind of treatment for quite some time. Globalization isn't something that they just out of nowhere decided to do, and there was no force behind it. There were actual motivations behind it, and the motivation was to maximize profit. And to be quite frank, that motivation has led to the precarious situation that we're experiencing now with inflation. Yes, the Russian invasion into Ukraine has a lot to do with this as well, especially when it comes to things like oil prices, the amount of money we're paying at the pump. When we talk about inflation, there are various different factors at play, and I think it's important to differentiate those factors. When we talk about the housing market and the inflation we're seeing there, that is very much the result of the Federal Reserve Reserve and its quantitative, policy, its quantitative easing policy, where it essentially provided liquidity to banks and, more importantly, private equity firms that decided to invest that money into residential real estate, thus pricing ordinary people out of the market. That's why we see inflation in the housing market. When it comes to inflation in other areas, whether it be new and used cars, electronics, things like that, we really do need to consider the fragility of the global economy, the fragility of having to rely on other countries to manufacture our goods, and more importantly, understanding why those goods are being manufactured in other countries. It's specifically done to maximize profits. And what happens to these corporations? Do they then turn around and say, listen, we've made poor decisions, and so we're gonna take a hit for this, we're gonna take a loss? No, I mean, they get to raise their prices on the limited supply. And when it comes to basic necessities, Americans are either going to shell out an insane amount of money to afford those necessities, or they're not gonna be able to afford them. And that's the situation we're in. When we hear about inflation, yes, domestic policy has a lot to do with it. Emboldening and empowering these corporations to constantly go after profit seeking over the best interests of the American people is something that the government has done time and time again, and they need to take responsibility for that, for sure. But to say that this is the end of globalization, I'm not buying it, because in order for this to be the end, you need to understand what motivated globalization in the first place: profits. And as long as we're living under this economic system that always prioritizes profits over people, globalization ain't going nowhere. They're always gonna look for the cheapest labor. They're always gonna look to either do away with or chip away labor rights here in the United States, or find cheap labor elsewhere. Anyway, I want to talk about this in more detail in a little bit. Nomi Prinz will be joining me to talk about not just the global economy, but what's been going on with the Federal Reserve here in the United States. Before we get to that though, I did want to read a few member comments, since I'm not going to be able to do that during this next break. Jim writes in our members section and says, it's all about CEOs' fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. And you're absolutely right about that. When we talk about this financial system, when we talk about capitalism and what the whole point of capitalism is, it's about maximizing profits. And the system that we're living under literally states that these companies have a legal responsibility to return as much on investment to their shareholders, right? And what is that gonna do? It's gonna put workers at a disadvantage here in the United States. It's gonna put workers at a disadvantage across the globe, because again, they're gonna be looking for cheap labor. Kabuki Dragon says, it's noon here on Maui. I'm very jealous, I gotta say. Going to listen today while I work in my garden on this 420, tending to the plants that help me to tolerate this show of a world. Happy holidays, TYT fam. I'm so jealous of you. That sounds lovely. I hope you're having a great time. Terry says, make Elon sleep on the factory floor since he likes not owning a home. Jim says, anybody who has ever been to Foxconn knows what a slave labor camp looks like. Exactly, I remember covering that story and also discussing the nets that they had set up around that factory because people were literally jumping to their deaths because the working conditions were so terrible. So this is the reality of the system that we're dealing with, and it's important to identify that, especially since you're not gonna get that kind of perspective in most of the corporate media or any of the corporate media.